What are some true events that are impossible to believe? Story 1. The Battle of Hollis. In roughly the 6th century BC, the Medes and the Lydians were at war. The war had lasted for 6 years and climaxed at the Battle of Hollis. During the battle, a solar eclipse began. Both sides believed that the gods were angry at their long and bloody war and were taking the sun away from them. They declared peace that day, literally throwing down their weapons and embracing their newly former enemies as the sun returned. They declared a formal peace shortly after. But yeah, a war ended because of a solar eclipse. Also, fun fact, it's one of the oldest historical events with a pinpoint accurate date due to lunar cycles. It's not some circa 6th century estimate. I mean, if I had no idea what a solar eclipse was, that'd be my reaction too. Story 2. There was a Japanese man called Sutomu Yamaguchi who was on his way to work in Hiroshima in 1945 when he saw falling through the sky 2 miles above where he stood what ultimately turned out to be the atomic bomb. He had just enough time to take cover in a ditch as the bomb detonated, and miraculously he survived. Somehow, the Hiroshima train station was still operational, and so Yamaguchi, battered, bombed, and bruised, decided to board a train to his family home so that he could recover in Nagasaki. 3 days later, Yamaguchi was called into work to explain what he saw, which he did. At work, as he began to tell the story of what happened, the second bomb dropped. It was the reinforced concrete walls around him that saved him this time, and Yamaguchi quickly ran to find his wife and son. Ground temperatures in the city reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, and radioactive rain poured down. The family's home was destroyed, but Yamaguchi's wife and son had thankfully been out shopping, looking for burn ointment for Yamaguchi when the bomb fell, and they survived. Despite this ordeal of having survived 2 nuclear explosions and subsequent radiation exposure, Yamaguchi went on to live until 93 years of age. He died in 2010 after being recognized by the Japanese government as Niju Hibakusha, or twice-bombed person. That reminds me of another famous Japanese person during that time. Chiune Sugihara was the vice consul for the Japanese embassy in Lithuania, which is in Europe, during World War II. Many Jews came to him for help because they wanted to flee from the ever-expanding Nazi Empire, and he just gave them all visas. He wasn't supposed to do that, and in fact, he got in trouble with his government for it. But by the time he was recalled to Japan, he had already saved many thousands of lives. The Jews then took the Trans-Siberian Railway and a boat to get to Japan. Today, he is of course no longer around, but he is one of the righteous among the nations. What makes that story more unbelievable is the Nazi John Heinrich Detlef Raby, who was a German businessman and Nazi party member best known for his efforts to stop war crimes during the Japanese Nanjing Massacre, and his work to protect and help Chinese civilians during the massacre that ensued. The Nanking Safety Zone, which he helped to establish, sheltered approximately 250,000 Chinese people from being killed. He officially represented Germany and acted as senior chief of the European-US establishment that remained in Nanjing. So we have a Japanese who saved lots of Jews from persecution and a German who saved a lot of Chinese from certain death. Talk about having bad luck. Story 3. In 1908, Russia showed up 12 days late to the Olympics because the world switched calendars while they did not. To accommodate the Russian team, some events were rescheduled so that the Russian elites could participate. This led to a longer duration for the Olympics, which lasted from April 27th to October 31st, making it the longest Olympic Games in history. It was nice of them to accommodate the Russians, though. Story 4. Michael Malloy, aka Mike the Durable, aka Iron Mike. During the Great Depression, 5 men took out a life insurance policy on a homeless alcoholic that they were sure was going to drink himself to death. The owner of a bar allowed him to drink for free, but he kept drinking and didn't die, so they tried to poison him with antifreeze. Didn't work. The turpentine, horse liniment, rat poison, and methanol still didn't work. A sandwich made with rotten sardines and tacks, still no luck. Then they took his drunk body out into the cold and poured water on him. He lived. Then they ran him over with a car. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks, but he survived. Then they poisoned him with carbon monoxide, and he finally died. They were all convicted of murder. Fun fact, ethyl alcohol is an antidote to ethylene glycol poisoning. They both are metabolized by the same enzyme, but alcohol takes priority. A serious alcoholic, when drunk, would just pass the glycol through their system with no issue. I guess being an alcoholic ain't that bad after all. Story 5. The Irish Potato Famine, 1845 through 1849, was a huge catastrophe that resulted in 1 million dying from starvation and 1 million leaving their homeland, mostly for North America. It's really hard to put into words how scarring this famine was for so many Irish people, and the suffering was tremendous. The psychological scars still impact Ireland's psyche today. It almost sounds like a fairy tale to hear how a sultan from a faraway land heard of this tragedy and went out of his way to send ships crammed with food and medicine to the Irish people dying from hunger and disease. When Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid heard of the suffering of his Irish dentist, he felt great compassion and sorrow for the plight of the Irish. The Sultan originally wanted to donate £10,000 to the starving populace, but British diplomats were aghast to hear this because Queen Victoria had donated a small sum of £2,000. The British government refused to accept the large donation, so he only donated a measly sum of £1,000, but he secretly sent 5 ships loaded with food. As you can imagine, the British government wasn't happy to hear of this, and the Navy attempted to blockade to stop the aid from arriving. The ships made it through the lines and arrived at Drogheda, where they dispersed the food. The people of Drogheda were so thankful that they had the Islamic and Ottoman symbols added to their city's coat of arms. It really does read like a fairy tale and is a gesture of great empathy. It's easy to imagine how happy the starving people were to see those Turkish ships arriving with food. According to James Hacktook, people were living, or rather starving, upon turnip tops, sand eels, and seaweed, a diet which no one in England would consider fit for their meanest animal. But the story does not end there. During the Crimean War, Britain joined the Ottoman Empire in their fight against the expanding Russia Empire. About 30,000 Irish soldiers served in the war, and it was noticed that the Irish people served enthusiastically in defense of the Sultan who had helped them during their greatest times of need. This highest form of compassion was even remembered during the First World War. It was reported that British officers complained that the Irish lacked the will to fight against the Ottomans, who remembered stories of the Ottoman Empire helping during a famine when no one else would. Sultan Abdülmecid is a model of faith in humanity being restored. There was no famine. The British took Irish crops to feed themselves and quash Irish independence. It was an act of genocide. I heard that most Irish Americans moved to America because of the famine too. The population still isn't back to pre-famine levels. Story 6. John ONeill, the FBI agent in charge of investigating Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in the 1990s, grew frustrated with the bureaucratic politics within the FBI and between the FBI and CIA that he felt hampered his mission. He decided to leave the FBI and take a higher-paying job in the private sector. On August 23, 2001, he became the chief of security at the World Trade Center. He was killed in the attacks just a few weeks later. John ONeill sent a colleague to the CIA to work under Richard Blee, who headed the bin Laden division. John's colleague at the CIA found out that Osama bin Laden's associates were headed to the US with visas. Rossini, John's appointed colleague, and his Doug Miller attempted to alert ONeill at the FBI, but Blee, the head of the bin Laden division, blocked the message. I'm sure the conspiracy theorists went wild with this one. Story 7. My colleague was on the plane to Hawaii when the entire top of the plane ripped off. They flew the rest of the way without any overhead, landed, and everyone walked off. Absolutely insane to see the pictures. Talk about being given a second chance. Aloha Airlines Flight 243, for those not familiar with it. Not only could kids now not believe it, but the public also could hardly believe it at the time. Only one death, a flight attendant who wasn't buckled in a seat at the time of the roof ripped off. My father-in-law was on a flight. He always keeps his seatbelt on unless getting up for some reason. Lady beside him made a comment. "You can take your seatbelt off now." He told her he never does unless it's necessary. Said you never know if something's going to happen and you don't want to be trying to get buckled in an emergency. She said, "You know what? That makes a lot of sense," and she buckled back up. An hour later, they hit some nasty turbulence and the plane dropped like a rock. Forget how many feet, but it was substantial. The drop was so fast that the flight attendant and her cart smashed against the ceiling and then dropped back down. He said he was sure he was done for. Other passengers not buckled in also hit the ceiling. Many people had bumps and bruises, and I think at least one had a broken arm. The lady beside him just kept thanking him over and over for convincing her to stay buckled. The incident was in the news, and he got 2 free flights out of it as an apology. 2 free flights for an incident like that? Let's hope he went the legal route instead. Story 8. John, the blind king of Bohemia, insisted on fighting in the battle and had his aides tie their horses together so they were not separated. He asked to be taken to where the battle was the loudest. The next day, they were all found dead with their horses still tied together. He was a blind king, not exactly a wise one. Story 9. The Battle of Bull Run, one of the first battles of the U.S. Civil War, occurred on and around Wilmer McLean's farm in Northern Virginia. Not wanting to live surrounded by war, McLean and his family moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The Battle of Appomattox Courthouse was the last significant battle between Union and Confederate forces. The Confederates signed the surrender order in Wilmer's sitting room. It is said that the Civil War started on Wilmer's farm and ended in his sitting room. He was not happy about it either, as he stated he had moved specifically to get away from the war as much as he possibly could. Maybe he was the reason the war happened. Story 10. Halley's Comet appeared in the sky when Mark Twain was born in 1835. The comet moves in a 75 or 76-year orbit, and as it neared Earth once again, Twain said, "I came in with Halley's Comet and I expect to go out with it." Sure enough, he died on April 21st, 1910, just as the comet made its next pass within sight of the Earth. When I was young, I remember thinking I'd see it twice in my lifetime. Now I don't even know if I'd want to be alive that long. I can't really think of a more interesting historic mind than Mark Twain. The guy was really ahead of his time. Story 12. Theodore Roosevelt found his boat was stolen, so he built a new boat, tracked the thieves down, and arrested them. He then proceeded to walk them multiple days without sleeping so they could receive a trial instead of just shooting them on the spot. It was in the middle of a harsh winter, so he didn't handcuff them for fear they'd get frostbite. So instead, he just kept himself awake by reading Tolstoy with a gun trained on them the whole trek. Teddy Roosevelt cannot be real. There are just too many stories like this. Story 13. Christmas Day, 1914, the truce on the World War I battlefields shows the humanity inside everyone, but they were able to wake up the next day and go straight back to war, killing the men that they'd spent a sincere day with. I can't remember where I saw or heard the story. I think from the BBC, but I believe from one of the last living Tommies who said that whilst they were forced to start shooting each other, the majority of shots intentionally missed, from both sides of no man's land. I believe it was also the same man who said in reference to Remembrance Day to also remember the Germans. That stuck with me. They were like our lads, sent to fight a war for war's sake, forced to do unspeakable things to other men because some higher-up told them they had to. One of the few times in history for two warring armies to stop fighting for one day to get along and celebrate Christmas. It seriously sounds like some kind of BS out of a fairy tale, but it is very well documented. It definitely sounds magical. They really didn't want to fight each other. Story 14. In 1903, the New York Times published an article about flying machines. They stated that it would take the combined efforts of all mathematicians and mechanics 1 to 10 million years for powered flight to be achieved. Anyway, about 9 weeks later, the Wright brothers achieved powered flight for the first time. They were also overly cynical afterwards. In 1910, they said that flight would only ever be for billionaires. Of course, we had commercial flights by around the 60s, achievable for many. It's insane to think about how much technology has progressed in the past 200 or so years. Story 15. As U.S. President, Roosevelt issued an executive order that made it illegal for U.S. citizens to keep U.S. gold coins. They made everyone return them or be subject to imprisonment and a large fine. The government confiscated over 2,600 metric tons. I've read that when people find buried gold in the U.S., it's usually from people hiding it during this time. No idea if that's true though. It's possible. It could have been buried for many different reasons. The company I work for just sold the collection of the latest find in buried treasure. It's called the Great Kentucky Hoard. Found earlier this year, 800 plus Civil War era gold Liberty coins. Some of the nicest examples known were found. Nobody knows for sure, but the theory is that it was buried by Civil War pursuers because of so many single $1 pieces. Usually the purser would bury the payroll before any conflicts, then dig up and disperse to the troops after battle. I guess that person didn't make it to dig them up. 160 years later, a corn farmer is prepping his field for the next crop, and bam! Another Roosevelt gem. I told you, I think the guy ain't real. Story 16. At the Battle of Dorylaeum during the First Crusade, Bohemond of Taranto ordered his troops to stand still for 8 hours in the baking sun in order to defeat Kilij Arslan. He crushed Kilij Arslan's forces. During another battle, Bohemond's men hadn't eaten for 2 weeks because they were besieged inside a fort they'd captured. None of them were in fighting order and they no longer had cavalry for the knights, so he asked the papal legate, Adhemar of Puy, what he should do. Adhemar of Puy spoke to God and said God told him that the men shouldn't eat for another week. The only way to fight the Muslims was to march his dying infantry straight out of the castle gates and use inferior infantry tactics against cavalry by running straight at them. It was guaranteed that they were going to lose. Again, they crushed the Muslims. The entirety of the First Crusade is insane, and it's a miracle that the Christians won because they did absolutely nothing right. It's a perfect example of continually failing upwards. This wasn't really a battle of who had the best army, but rather who had the worst. Story 17. John Tyler was the 10th President of the United States. He was born in 1790 and took office in 1841. His grandson died in 2020. When you look at things this way, history doesn't really seem all that distant. Story 18. On the 1st of February 1942, following a bombing raid on the Marshall Islands, the Enterprise came under attack by 5 twin-engine Japanese bombers. The lead aircraft, led by Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai, badly damaged by anti-aircraft fire, turned back towards the Enterprise, attempting to ram it. Seeing this, Gaido abandoned his watch post and jumped in a nearby Dauntless parked on the flight deck, and returned fire using the rear-facing .30 caliber machine gun. His fire disabled the aircraft, causing it to narrowly missed the Enterprise, only hitting parked aircraft, including the one Gaido was in, before spiraling into the sea. Upon seeing this act, Vice Admiral William Halsey spot promoted him to Aviation Machinist Mate First Class, and later he survived being shot down, only to be picked up by the Japanese, brutally tortured, and finally thrown overboard whilst attached to an anchor. His ending really sucked and showed how brutally the Japanese treated their POWs. Yeah, Japanese history isn't exactly all anime and manga. Story 19. In 1944, during the Allied invasion of France, 2 American paramedics, Ken Moore and Robert Wright, 101st Airborne, saved around 80 soldiers from both sides, Allied and Axis. They set themselves up in a church, had only what was in their first aid kits and medic bags, and had a strict no-gun policy. The church was almost destroyed by a mortar shell, but it didn't go off. It was virtually destroyed again due to friendly fire. Ken Moore would risk his life by venturing out of the church and finding injured soldiers, and both medics stayed behind at the church, even though the rest of their forces had to retreat. Wright took on the responsibility of looking after the soldiers. The church still stands in France. The blood-stained pews are still there, and a broken tile from the mortar shell was never fixed, to honor the legacy of these men. This is very simplified and probably inaccurate in a few ways, but it is still an incredible story. I live near the 101st. I was invited to this big spectacle on the base that had this high-ranking army official walk among the troops. They had not been able to do this for a few years because the 101st was so heavily deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when they did it, they invited all veteran soldiers in town to come and stand on the field to present themselves. That's when I found out there were still men here in my town who fought in the 101st during World War II. Some were in wheelchairs, but they still came. It was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. I had no idea I lived among them. It's been 15 years now, so they may all be gone now, but for a while, I lived alongside them. That church has been through a world war and is still standing. I think there's a message in all of that. Story 20. Saint Olga of Kiev. Her story is the ultimate revenge tale. I highly recommend people look her up, but in short, her husband was killed by a neighboring tribe and she sought vengeance. The neighboring faction then sought to take over her own, seeing as she was a weak woman and ruling in her dead husband's place as her own son was too young. She invited them into her town as a show of honor. When the large party of messengers arrived, they were soon attacked and backed into a massive trench that Olga's people had dug the nights before. Standing over the trench, she asked them if they found the honor to their taste, and buried them alive. But she wasn't even close to finishing her quest for vengeance. She sent a message back to the enemy saying that she would accept an allegiance by marriage, painting herself as such a feeble woman that she would gladly relinquish her power to her enemy. But she requested all high chieftains to visit her town, to socialize and garner favor. The chieftains came and she invited them into the bathhouse to relax before a feast. They were locked inside and burned to death. death. But she wasn't done. Her next feat is her most incredible. After taking out most people of power from the other faction, she demanded tribute from their town and villages. Not in gold, not in any material goods, but in the form of sparrows and pigeons. Thousands were delivered to her. The next night, she ordered her soldiers to tie a strip of sulfur to the birds' legs, set it alight, and release the birds. The birds flew back to the houses and homes that they had nested in and burned every village to the ground. The sky was apparently a blaze of fire for days. Olga emerged victorious and satiated. Don't mess with Olga of Kiev. She is known quite aptly as the patron saint of vengeance and defiance. The technical death metal band Gorod did an entire album about her called A Perfect Absolution. The few songs pertaining to your points in order here are 1. Sailing into the Earth, Burying Them in the Trench, 2. Varangian Paradise, Bathhouse Burning, 3. Birds of Sulfur, tying bits of flaming sulfur to birds. If you're a metalhead and like history, this album is an absolute goldmine. At one point, you gotta stop answering the invite. Story 21. The Four Pests Campaign. Mao Zedong, in his infinite hubris, thought that there would be no repercussions from an attempt to completely eliminate rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. Plot twist, there were repercussions. Millions of people organized into groups and hit noisy pots and pans to prevent sparrows from resting in their nests, with the goal of causing them to drop dead from exhaustion. Sparrows were replaced with bedbugs, as the extermination of sparrows had upset the ecological balance, which subsequently resulted in surging locust and insect populations that destroyed crops due to a lack of a natural predator. The ecological disruption was one of several factors that led to a famine that killed 45 million people. Sometimes the easy solutions aren't done for a reason. Story 22. I mean, the obvious answer is the fact that we landed on the moon. When we did is by far one of, if not the most insanely impressive achievements of human beings ever, and will likely never really be duplicated. In the span of a handful of years, when the technology was unfathomably infantile, we launched a rocket to outer space with people on board, traveled to the moon, landed on it, walked around, came back inside, launched back up and returned to Earth, plummeted to the surface on fire, and lived. It was a global achievement. It was maybe the most pure human moment that everyone on planet Earth experienced together as a species, all with the computation of basically a calculator. The moon landing happened 29 years after the first man-made object reached space, 20 to 12 years after Sputnik, and 8 freaking years after the first manned spaceflight. The speed of advancement is nothing short of insane. There were people who could still recall the first powered flight and were still getting used to the fact that airplane flights were something anyone could do. If I'd been there to see it, I would probably have thought nothing of the idea that we'd have moon tourists and colonies by the 21st century. There's nothing more I'd love to see than another space race. Story 23. Everything having to do with Mad Jack Churchill. He reads like someone's self-inserted OC in a historical fiction based on World War II, except he's all real. He was a Brit who fought in World War II without guns, instead preferring a longbow, a claymore sword, and bagpipes. Despite this, he won. A lot. He single-handedly took a whole village back from the Nazis by taking his shirt off and stealing around to scare the crap out of them with his sword. After the Nazis captured him once and held him prisoner under the mistaken belief he was related to Winston Churchill, the Allies raided the prison and he was set free. Or he would have, had he not already escaped 2 weeks prior. He was on the beach on D-Day with men under his command and held them up in their boat while he played a song on bagpipes. Finished, lobbed a grenade onto the beach and then charged. The war ended and he was bored, so he went to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. That ended too, so he got bored in retirement and invented river surfing. This is just a scrap of the historical anomaly that is Mad Jack Churchill. He ended up with an office job in London and commuted to work by train each day. If you ended up in a carriage with him on the way home in the evening, you'd be startled to see a respectable-looking older gentleman get up out of his seat, open a window, hurl his briefcase out, then sit down and keep reading his newspaper. The rail line ran past his house, so he'd throw his briefcase into the backyard to save having to carry it home from the station and to let his wife know he'd be home soon and to put the kettle on. Yeah, I'm sure Winston Churchill is gonna let his cousin go to war without guns. The Nazis sure weren't known for their brain power. Story 24. The Ghost Army in World War II. Essentially, an American group of troops would deploy dummy tanks, broadcast fake radio chatter, and deploy loud sound effects over speakers to fool the Nazis into thinking there was a large military presence coming their way. The Ghost Army was used to deceive the Nazis and make them send their military presence elsewhere, which provided openings for the real Allied forces to move in. This was used in the later parts of the war. I never learned about this in school, but I discovered it on my own and thought it was fascinating. Imagine thinking a whole mess of tanks are heading your way, but in reality it's a couple of inflatable dummies and a few speakers. Psychological warfare is very real. It's even mentioned in The Art of War. Story 25. The masses marching to the Berlin Wall and tearing it down only happened because earlier that day during a press conference an East German official, Gunther Schabowski, accidentally incorrectly said leaving East Germany was legal, effective immediately. As far as I know, this becomes effective. It is right away, immediately, is still a famous thing to say in Germany. It would eventually have happened anyway, but it wasn't legal yet. However, people just did it anyway because the guy got visibly confused during the press conference and said the wrong thing. I was a teenager then. An utterly wonderful story came through Usenet, which was kind of like Reddit before the World Wide Web, basically chat groups via email. If I recall correctly, it was written by a West German who had been out and about when a couple of guys in an East German vehicle asked him for directions. They explained that the wall was down and wanted to have a look around West Berlin. He spoke about a few highlights, then they invited him to be their tour guide for the day, an offer that he gladly accepted. The rest of the email/post was this guy telling the story of the most amazing day of his life, trading stories of their respective lives within and without the Iron Curtain while directing the driver around his city. At the end of the day, they dropped him home and he shared his wonderful story. Crazy to think that the fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't even that long ago. Story 26. The USA banned alcohol for about 10 years. The British government bought the entire world's tea crop for 1 year, as in every ounce produced in every country in the world was purchased by them in the middle of World War II, just because. King George III was against the Stamp Act, and when it was repealed by a politician he supported, a statue of the king was paid for and put up in New York by the people there in thanks, pre-revolution. My grandparents used to have an unused Prohibition prescription for whiskey they found in a book at a garage sale. It was years after they bought the book they started reading it that it fell out. They couldn't remember where they bought the book. It was a fracture and dislocation medical book. Can you imagine something like Prohibition now? Imagine spring break without booze. Story 27. During Alexander the Great's destruction of the Mediterranean, he was going to leave a small island named Tyre for later, as it would have been hard to besiege it, but the people of Tyre laughed and mocked him, so he literally built a bridge to their island and then conquered it. He was a 20-ish-year-old kid who had basically the best possible education anyone alive would have asked for. You've heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I bet. 3 generations of such immense influence, we still talk about them all more than 2,000 years later, and Alexander the Great was Aristotle's student. Pretty interesting to have such renowned characters all lead up to Alexander the Great. That being said, for someone who was taught by Aristotle, he got wrapped up in what it means to be a king, ended up dying very likely by his own troops' hands. Sure, he conquered a lot, but you'd hope someone who had the teachings of people Western society considers philosopher gods wouldn't say, name 50 conquered cities after himself, or burn down a defenseless city on a whim. Ultimate power corrupts. I personally think that Alexander the Great wasted most of the gifts to accomplish essentially a mass amount of war. Though his name is remembered, to some that's all that matters. This guy conquered half the world by the time he was 30. Why on earth would you even try to mess with him? Story 28. The Swedish king Gustav II had to wear glasses, like badly, but was too vain and refused. In battle, he proceeded to lose his direction and got lost in the smoke, leading him to land behind the enemy's lines. Needless to say, he didn't survive that. So essentially, he died because he didn't want to wear his glasses. Wear your glasses, kids. Life is short, and so is your sight. Story 29. In recent Russian history, where a warlord launched a coup and took over a city of 1 million people, almost got to Moscow without any resistance, but patched things up with Putin and turned around about an hour before reaching the city. This happened in 2023. By the way, this warlord is also a restaurant oligarch that owns a 25,000-strong mercenary army that's been one of the brutal militant groups to fight in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The fact that this happened this year at the time of this recording thing is kind of mind-boggling. Story 30. Most likely when the conquistadors under Cortez wanted to build catapults to attack Tenochtitlan after convincing him to halt the assault they built too. Unfortunately, they didn't actually have any siege masters who actually knew how to build them, but just a dude who was convinced he knew how. When they fired them, they threw the boulders straight up and landed right in front of the catapults. This caused much confusion to the inhabitants of the city. The incident was recorded on both sides. I like to believe it inspired the character of Wile E. Coyote. New World versus Old World wars are still crazy to learn about. I wonder what the natives must have thought when they saw this industrial-era weapon. Story 31. This happened in Buenos Aires in 1988. An elderly woman named Marta Espina was walking near a carpet store when a toy poodle named Catchy fell from a 13th floor balcony and tragically landed on her head, causing her immediate death. Unfortunately, Catchy also didn't survive the fall, but the events didn't end there. Another woman named Edith Sola, driven by curiosity or desire to help, rushed across the street only to be struck by a bus from the 55 bus line. This marked the second fatality caused by Catchy's fall. And incredibly, there was yet another death. The identity of the third victim remains unknown, but reports indicate that a man suffered a heart attack while witnessing the entire incident unfold. He passed away in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. You guys can look it up. It's crazy but true. The dog's name was Catchy. That's just tragic. Story 32. The CIA sent hundreds of assassins after Fidel Castro. Plenty of cartoonishly silly plans too, from exploding cigars to poison hair. One of the best recorded attempts was when they sent a female spy to seduce him and then murder him when he was not looking. But in the bedroom, when he realized her plan, he turned his back to her. She prepared to strike. He grabbed a cigar and told her, "If you're gonna kill me, then do it already." She just stood there shocked and said she couldn't do it. Castro was like, "Yeah, of course not," and they just made love instead. Wild story straight from the CIA records of the woman, LOL. Imagine having so much riz that you survive an assassination attempt. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you have a similar story that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and make sure to subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.